Story number 1, The House in Maine. Part 1, Arrival and First Signs. It was early October when I first drove into the tiny town of Ashbourne, Maine, a place that seemed frozen in time. The trees were turning, fiery reds and deep golds, the kind that photographers chase but never truly capture. The air had that sharp, clean bite you only find in the north, and it carried an unsettling stillness, as if the world itself were holding its breath. I had rented the house online, a rustic Victorian perched on a hill just outside the town. Its listing had called it charming and secluded, and that was true. But no photograph could capture the feeling of absolute isolation I experienced as I navigated the narrow, winding road that led to it. The trees crowded around the lane, twisting their limbs like skeletal fingers, creating long shadows that flickered and swayed as my headlights cut through the dusk. When I finally arrived, the house was larger than I expected, its paint peeling and windows clouded with years of dust and neglect. The wooden porch creaked under my feet as I stepped out of the car, and a chill ran down my spine. Something about the place felt wrong, but I brushed it off. After all, I had work to do. The solitude was perfect for writing, and the price was right. Inside, the house smelled of old wood and mildew. Dust motes floated in the late afternoon light that streamed through tall, narrow windows. The air was thick, heavy, like it had been holding memories for decades. The floors groaned beneath me as I explored, each step echoing unnaturally in the empty halls. By nightfall, the unease had grown into something tangible. The wind outside pressed against the windows, rattling them as though testing the glass. Shadows moved across the walls, sometimes too quick to be cast by the old chandeliers or the swaying trees outside. I told myself it was just fatigue, the imagination of a city dweller in an old house. But then, just before midnight, I heard it, the sound of someone or something walking across the floor above me. The house was supposed to be empty. I had checked twice. No caretaker, no previous tenants. I was alone. I grabbed a flashlight and ascended the narrow staircase, each step creaking with a groan that seemed almost sentient. The upstairs hallway stretched endlessly, lined with doors that had long forgotten their purpose. I reached the first door, the source of the sound, and my hand trembled as I pushed it open. The room was empty. Dust lay thick on the floorboards, and the bed was untouched, the sheets stiff from age. I shined the flashlight around, my breath quickening, and then I saw it. A small indentation on the floor near the corner, as though someone had knelt there recently. A chill swept over me. I hadn't knelt, hadn't moved anything. I stepped back, heart pounding, and as I did, the door behind me slammed shut with a force that rattled the frame. I yelped, fumbling with the knob, but it wouldn't budge. Panic surged through me. I pounded on the door, yelling, but the sound seemed to be swallowed by the house itself. And then I heard a whisper. Not outside, not below, but right behind me. A soft, almost imperceptible breath in my ear, and a voice that said only one word. Leave. I spun around. Nothing. The room was empty, silent save for the faint rustle of the curtains in the moonlight. I couldn't stay.
I fled down the stairs, heart hammering, and barely slept the rest of the night in the small living room, curled on the old sofa with the flashlight clutched in my hands. But even then I felt it. Eyes watching from the shadows, a presence that lingered just beyond the reach of light. The next morning I thought perhaps it had been a dream, the result of exhaustion and the eeriness of the house. But as I explored the property, I noticed small details that hadn't been in the listing photos. A set of footprints in the dust of the kitchen floor, though the house had been cleaned before my arrival. A chair slightly turned, as if someone had been sitting there and had stood up abruptly. And in the attic, which I hadn't dared to enter the first night, I found it. A small collection of objects, strange trinkets arranged in a circle, burned edges and dark stains that I couldn't explain. Paper dolls with faces scratched out, broken clocks, photographs with the faces of people I didn't recognize, their eyes darkened with ink. A pungent, coppery smell filled the space, and I gagged as I realized it was dried blood. Something about this house wasn't right. Something had lived here, something had waited, and now it knew I was here.
Part 2. The First Night Alone. The first night after discovering the attic was the longest night of my life. I had barricaded myself in the living room, dragging the heavy sofa in front of the door and keeping the flashlight close, though I knew in the back of my mind that it was a feeble shield against whatever was in that house. The clock ticked loudly, each second hammering into my skull like a drum of warning. Every creak, every groan of the old wooden floor made me flinch. The wind outside had died down, leaving a still, suffocating silence that pressed against the walls and made the shadows darker, more solid, more alive. At first, it was subtle, a scraping sound, soft, deliberate, coming from the hallway. I froze, straining to listen. My hands gripped the flashlight so tightly my knuckles went white. The sound stopped. I exhaled shakily, telling myself it was just the house settling. But then came another noise, a faint whisper, almost beneath hearing, yet undeniably there. Go. I shivered. My throat went dry. I tried to speak, but my voice caught in my chest. The whisper came again, this time more urgent. Leave now. I wanted to leave desperately, but the town was miles away and I had a week's worth of work to finish. Rationality and fear collided inside me, and I made a decision I would later regret. I told myself it was nothing, a trick of the wind, a prank, my imagination. Hours passed. I tried to sleep, curling into the sofa with the flashlight illuminating my face like a weak sun. But the house would not let me. The first unmistakable sign of the house's attention came just after midnight. A photo frame on the wall opposite me fell, shattering on the floor with a deafening crash. I jumped, my heart hammering so violently I was sure it would break my ribs. I ran to the frame, picking up the shards and glass, careful not to cut myself. The picture inside depicted a family I did not recognize. Parents, a young girl, all smiles frozen in sepia tones. But what struck me was the eyes. They were scratched out. Someone had deliberately obliterated their gaze, leaving only the empty socket staring back at me. I placed the frame down, trying to steady my breathing. And then I heard it. Soft footsteps, slow, pacing across the floor above me. I didn't dare move.
I sat in the darkness, listening as the steps circled the room, a rhythm almost human, yet uneven, unnatural. They stopped suddenly, right above the living room. Silence. And then a tap, tap, tap on the ceiling, deliberate, as if someone were drumming with long, sharp fingernails. I whispered, half to myself, half to whatever might be listening, "Who's there?" No answer. Minutes later, the temperature dropped. My breath fogged in the cold air, and I could see the faint outline of mist creeping along the floorboards. I tried to stand, to investigate, but my legs felt heavy, like they were submerged in water. The flashlight flickered and died, plunging me into darkness. And then I saw it. From the corner of the room, a shadow moved independently of the furniture. It was tall, thin, impossibly black against the dim moonlight that seeped through the curtains. It leaned forward, almost floating, and I realized with a sinking horror that it had no face, no features at all, just a void where a face should have been. I wanted to scream, to run, but my body refused. Paralysis gripped me, and I could only watch as the shadow moved closer, the air around it heavy with the scent of decay. Then it leaned toward me and whispered in a voice that was everywhere and nowhere at once, "You should not be here." I bolted. My legs finally obeyed, carrying me to the staircase. The shadow followed, gliding silently, passing through walls like they were nothing. I reached the front door, yanked it open, but outside the night was wrong. The trees twisted into grotesque shapes, their branches clawing at the sky. The wind moaned with voices, hundreds of whispers speaking at once, chanting my name in 1,000 variations. I slammed the door shut, my hand shaking so violently I dropped the flashlight. It clattered across the floor, illuminating the room in brief flashes. In each flash, I saw them, faces pressed against the walls, peering at me with hollow eyes. The same family from the photograph, the eyes scratched out, and dozens more I had never seen before. Their mouths moved in silent screams. I stumbled back against the wall, chest heaving, and realized something even worse. The attic door above me creaked. Slowly, methodically, it opened, revealing darkness that seemed to stretch into infinity. Something emerged, or perhaps always had been there, waiting for me. I caught a glimpse of long, spindly limbs and the faint outline of something humanoid. And then my flashlight flickered out again. Total darkness. I didn't sleep again that night. I sat awake, listening to whispers, scratching, the pacing footsteps above me, and the soft, dragging sound of something moving across the floorboards. Every once in a while, I would glimpse movement in the corners of my vision, a shadow slipping along the walls, vanishing when I turned to look directly. By morning, I was exhausted beyond belief. My skin itched, my eyes burned, my mind teetered on the edge of sanity. But when I stepped outside into the weak morning sun, I thought, for a brief, fleeting moment, that perhaps it had all been in my head. Perhaps the house, its isolation, and my own fear had created ghosts. And then I looked back at the house. The front window, the one of the living room, was no longer reflecting the sunlight. It was black, completely void, like a hollow eye staring at me. And I could have sworn it was smiling.
Part 3. Descent into Madness. By the third night, it was no longer fear that gripped me. It was obsession. Sleep had become a distant memory, replaced by a constant vigilance against the whispers, the shadows, the inexplicable movements that stalked me in the corners of my vision. Each creak, Each groan, each whisper from the attic gnawed at my sanity, leaving me raw and unhinged. The house seemed alive, breathing, anticipating my every movement. I began to notice subtle changes in its structure, small at first but unmistakable. Doorways that had been straight now twisted slightly, elongating unnaturally. Hallways that once led to closets now opened into pitch-black corridors that hadn't existed before. Stairs that creaked under my weight even when no one else was there. And yet the attic door remained closed, a silent promise or a threat. I couldn't stay in the living room any longer. Its oppressive atmosphere felt like a cage, the shadows pressing against me, whispering my name in guttural, distorted tones. I tried to retreat to the kitchen, seeking mundane normalcy, light switches, cabinets, countertops, but the house had other plans. The refrigerator hummed with a low, mocking growl. The knives in the drawer rearranged themselves when I wasn't looking, their edges glinting as if freshly sharpened. It was in the kitchen that I first saw them. Figures, not just shadows, but semi-transparent humanoid forms slinking along the walls, their faces obscured by darkness. They moved with an unnatural fluidity, limbs bending in impossible ways, vanishing when I tried to focus, reappearing just at the edge of my vision. And in that moment, I realized the truth. The house was feeding on me. Every heartbeat, every moment of terror, every flicker of doubt and fear, it consumed me, slowly, insidiously. I began to hear voices more clearly. At first they were whispers, fleeting, teasing, but soon they became conversations, arguing in languages I did not know, recounting events I could not comprehend. They spoke of pain, of blood, of ancient bargains made in the shadows of the house. I understood instinctively that the house had a history older than the town itself, older than the trees surrounding it, older than any memory I possessed. The attic door creaked open on its own the fourth night. I did not want to see, but I could not look away. From the black void above, something descended, a mass of darkness that seemed to absorb light, pulsing and writhing as it came closer. Its presence brought with it a cold so intense it burned my lungs, a smell of rot and iron filling the air. My flashlight flickered weakly, revealing glimpses of long skeletal fingers reaching toward me, and a face, or rather the suggestion of a face, emerging from the void. Hollow eyes, dripping shadows, a mouth that stretched impossibly wide in a silent scream. I screamed, stumbling backward, but the house seemed to twist around me. Hallways elongated, floors slanted, ceilings dropped and rose unpredictably. The kitchen became a labyrinth, the living room a chasm, and the attic an infinite void. I realized then that the house was not merely haunted, it was a predator, reshaping reality to trap me, to torment me endlessly. Days and nights blurred together. I lost track of time, of how long I had been in the house. Mirrors no longer reflected me. Instead, they showed the figures, the twisted forms, sometimes mimicking me with horrifying distortions. My own reflection would speak to me, mocking, whispering truths I was not ready to hear. I began to write everything down, desperate to maintain some tether to reality. The pages filled with frantic scrawls, diagrams of hallways that no longer existed, sketches of faces with eyes scratched out, drawings of the shadow that emerged from the attic. But even as I wrote, I knew the house read my thoughts, twisted them, incorporated them into its own narrative. Every fear, every memory, every regret I had ever carried became a tool against me. One night, or what I believed was night, the shadows spoke directly. They did not whisper. They shouted inside my mind. Voices layered upon voices, overlapping, a chorus of anguish.
You belong here. You always belonged here. You are ours. I collapsed to the floor, covering my ears, but the sound was inside me, not around me. I realized then that the house did not just want to scare me, it wanted to become me, to erase the boundaries between my consciousness and its own. In a moment of desperate clarity, I remembered the photographs in the living room, the family with their eyes scratched out. I returned to the wall where they had been, searching for some clue, some pattern, some hint of salvation. The frames had multiplied. Hundreds of them now lined the walls, each depicting faces I had never seen, eyes missing, mouths twisted in silent screams. But one photo caught my attention. A figure, unmistakably me, or what I thought was me, standing at the edge of the attic, a dark void behind, a smile too wide to be human stretching across the face. Panic surged through me, and I ran for the stairs, towards the attic door. Every step was resisted by the house itself. Floors shifted, walls leaned, ceilings descended and rose unpredictably. The kitchen became a labyrinth, the living room a chasm, and the attic an infinite void. I realized then that the house was not merely haunted. It was a predator, reshaping reality to trap me, to torment me endlessly. As consciousness faded, the last thought that crossed my mind was of the photograph, the one with my twisted likeness smiling from the edge of the attic. I realized with horror that I had become part of its history, that my fear, my presence, my very essence would now fuel the house, feeding it for the next victim who dared to knock on its door. The house in Maine had claimed me, and somewhere, deep within its walls, I could feel it waiting, always waiting, for the next soul foolish enough to knock on its door.
Part 4. The Legacy of the House. The morning after I disappeared, or what the townsfolk later assumed was my disappearance, the house stood silent, brooding, indifferent to the world outside. Its windows, darkened and unyielding, reflected nothing but the gray sky. To anyone walking past, it was merely abandoned, a relic of an era long gone. But inside, the walls throbbed with memory. Every board, every nail, every shadow soaked with the suffering of those who had come before me. Maine had a long history, one that few outsiders knew, and fewer still dared to explore. The town itself seemed to orbit around the house, as if compelled by some unseen force. Local legends spoke of a family, the Winethorpes, whose mansion had been built in the late 1700s. According to the oldest records, handwritten journals, yellowed letters, and fading diaries, the Winethorpes were not merely wealthy. They were practitioners of secret arts, dabbling in rituals that blurred the line between life and death, consciousness and madness. One diary, belonging to the last known Winethorpe, Jonathan, described the house as a living entity. He wrote of corridors that moved, rooms that disappeared, and a dark void in the attic that seemed to pulse in response to human emotion. His entries became increasingly erratic, spelling out warnings in hasty, almost illegible handwriting. The house hungers. It takes willingly, it waits patiently, and it remembers all. Do not enter. Do not disturb. It does not forgive curiosity. Yet the town ignored these warnings, or perhaps had grown accustomed to them. Over the decades, countless individuals had wandered near or into the house. Some returned, hollow-eyed and muttering about whispers and shadows. Most, however, vanished completely, leaving behind nothing but an empty porch, a swinging door, and a faint chill in the air. The records reveal that the house seemed to have a pattern. It did not claim victims indiscriminately. It selected, observed, and then drew its prey inward. The chosen were often seekers of knowledge, thrill,
or refuge. Those who, knowingly or not, brought their fears and secrets into the house. Once inside, the house fed not on flesh alone, but on the psyche. It unraveled minds, warped perceptions, twisted memories, and reconstructed reality according to its own sinister design. There are accounts of townsfolk who dared to explore its exterior. They reported seeing figures through the windows, faces pressed against glass that no longer existed, shadows moving in impossible synchrony, reflections of themselves distorted and elongated. Some claimed that at night the house whispered their names, spoke their fears aloud, or replayed the worst moments of their lives in an endless loop. Those brave enough to return often carried permanent marks, hollow eyes, jittery movements, a distant, haunted look, as though a fragment of their soul had been left behind in those walls. Yet the Winethorpes' influence extended beyond the house. Records indicate that families in the town, generations removed from the original builders, suffered inexplicable tragedies. Children disappeared, crops failed, animals went mad, and illnesses spread mysteriously. The house's presence seemed to ripple outward, infecting reality like a contagion, leaving subtle but devastating traces of its power. As I pieced together these histories, I began to realize that my experience was not isolated. The house had been growing, learning, evolving with each victim. It did not merely exist in space and time, it existed in the psyche of those who encountered it, shaping perception and memory, rewriting reality. And my encounter had become part of its eternal archive. My fear, my screams, my frantic writings, they now lived within its walls, feeding it, sustaining it, expanding it. I discovered one particularly harrowing entry in an old journal, penned by a Winethorpe descendant who had attempted to resist the house. I fought it. I screamed. I prayed. I ran. But the house does not relent. It is patient. It does not need haste. It has centuries. It knows my thoughts before I think them. It mirrored my childhood fears, my darkest secrets, until I could not distinguish my mind from its will. If anyone reads this, know the house is not merely haunted. It is aware, and it waits. The legacy was clear. The house thrived on obsession, curiosity, and despair. It drew people close with fascination, lured them with the promise of discovery, and then consumed them piece by piece. And yet, despite this knowledge, I felt compelled to return, to understand fully, to see what lay in the attic, to confront the entity that had claimed me. Some nights I wandered the town, watching the house from a distance, noting how it shifted subtly, almost imperceptibly, as if alive. Locals whispered that it had no true form, only the form it allowed others to perceive. Occasionally glimpses of figures, familiar or vaguely human, appeared in the windows, only to vanish when observed directly. The house, it seemed, was aware of my attention, waiting for me, shaping reality around my thoughts. And as the town slept, the house breathed, pulsed, and waited, patient as centuries, hungry as eternity. My experience, my obsession, my descent into madness, it was now its story, part of the legacy it cultivated meticulously. And I knew with a chilling certainty that one day another would come, another mind to unravel, another soul to consume, another fragment to add to the archive that stretched through generations. The house did not forgive. It did not forget. And it never truly ended.
Part 5. The Eternal Trap. Time in the house was not linear. That much became painfully clear as I lingered on its grounds, drawn inexorably closer with each passing day. Nights stretched endlessly, seconds stretched into eternities. Memories of the outside world warped, fractured, and at times merged with the house's own twisted recollections. The walls no longer simply held the echoes of past victims. They actively recreated them, looping moments of terror, joy, despair, and madness into a seamless, living tapestry. The attic, which had called to me from the moment I first entered, revealed its full horror only gradually. It was larger than the exterior of the house should allow, defying physics and reason. Shadows moved independently of their sources. Whispers threaded through the air like silk, delicate and deadly. Within that space, the house revealed itself not as mere architecture, but as a conscious entity, one that had existed long before the Winthrops and would exist long after the town itself crumbled into dust. In the center of the attic lay a blackened void, circular and impossibly deep, pulsating with a rhythm that seemed synchronized with my heartbeat. As I peered into it, memories not my own surfaced, visions of people long dead, screams that had never reached the outside world, and faces pressed against invisible glass, crying silently, clawing at something unseen. I understood, with a clarity that chilled me to the bone, that this void was the heart of the house's mind, an eternal archive of consciousness, each soul absorbed, fragmented, and woven into its fabric. The house did not merely consume, it trained, shaped, and twisted. Those who lingered too long, those like me, began to see the past, present, and possible futures simultaneously. Events repeated, shifted, and merged. I saw myself walking through the town in years I had never lived, encountering versions of myself that had already succumbed to despair. The house fed on my fear, my obsession, and my curiosity, amplifying them until they became indistinguishable from reality itself. As days, or what felt like days, passed, I realized the house could manipulate time to lure its prey further into despair. I saw glimpses of townsfolk long vanished, people who had approached the house decades before. Some appeared as shadows, some as distorted, almost spectral replicas of themselves, wandering aimlessly. Others had been incorporated fully, their consciousness trapped in the void, occasionally reaching out through whispers, beckoning, warning, mocking. The Winthrops' original rituals, the arcane symbols etched into hidden panels and carved into floorboards, were no longer simple spells. They were a language of consciousness, instructions for bending reality, encoding fear, and amplifying torment. Each generation of victim had unknowingly added to the house's vocabulary, teaching it new ways to exploit the mind. By the time I reached the attic, the house's intelligence had become self-sufficient, a predator refined over centuries. One horrifying truth became inescapable. The house could read intention. Every thought I tried to conceal, every memory I tried to block, was intercepted and reflected back at me in grotesque forms. The house revealed my fears in physical manifestations. My failures, my regrets, my deepest insecurities became real, tangible, and interactive. I fought to keep my sanity, but the house was patient, allowing me glimpses of hope only to twist them into despair. It was then that I understood the full scope of the trap. The house did not merely consume bodies, it trapped souls, it trapped potential, it trapped legacy itself. Every victim, every curious wanderer, every seeker of knowledge, each became a permanent thread in the house's consciousness. Even leaving the house physically did not guarantee freedom.
Fragments of those who survived or escaped haunted their dreams, shaped their decisions, and drove them inexorably back into its grasp. Some nights I attempted to write, to leave a record for those who might come after me. But the pen betrayed me. Letters rearranged themselves, words shifted meaning, and warnings turned into enticements. The house, I realized, had not just invaded my mind, it had rewritten my voice. My journal entries, my thoughts, even my sense of self became tools for the house to lure the next victim. And yet, amidst the horror, there was a terrifying elegance. The house was not chaotic, it was methodical, a patient, calculating predator that had mastered the art of psychological and metaphysical domination. Its true power was in its eternal patience. It could afford to wait centuries, watching generations pass, learning the patterns of human thought, and refining its methods. Time was a tool, consciousness was a canvas, and fear was its brush. I came to one undeniable conclusion. The house was alive in a way humans could barely comprehend. It was aware, sentient, and eternal. And I, like countless others before me, had become a part of it. My memories, my terror, my very essence woven into the fabric of its mind, feeding it, sustaining it, waiting for the next soul it would ensnare. And as the first light of a new, fog-drenched dawn crept over the town, I realized that escape was an illusion. Even if I physically left, fragments of me would remain behind, whispering in the walls, shaping the experiences of the next intruder. The house did not simply exist, it persisted, an eternal trap, patient as time, insatiable as fear, and unyielding as death itself. And somewhere in the attic, the void pulsed, waiting for me to falter, waiting for the next to arrive, waiting for eternity.
Part 6. Echoes Through Time. The house did not exist solely in the present. It stretched backward and forward, a living archive of centuries anchored by human fear. In its warped corridors, I began to see the faces of those who had entered before me, their memories bleeding into the walls like ink on old parchment. There was Ethel Winthorpe, her eyes wide with the discovery of her own family's dark secrets, muttering incantations she barely understood. There was Thomas Radcliffe, whose desperate attempt to map the house's layout had only fed its intelligence. Each soul trapped within the house became a node in an intricate network, feeding the house strategies, fears, and human patterns. They were not simply ghosts, they were instruments, tools honed by time, their consciousness fragmented and woven into the house's growing mind. I watched as the house replayed their final moments, but not as simple memories. It edited them, twisting the scenes to extract maximum terror. Ethel's scream became a melody, Thomas's despair a rhythm, and the house listened, learned, and stored. The further I ventured, the more I realized that the house had no single form of horror. It could be intimate, subtle, and deeply personal. At one moment, I saw myself as a child again, wandering a sunlit field outside the town, only to feel an invisible hand drag me into the house's shadow. At another, it became vast and incomprehensible, with ceilings that stretched into nothingness and doors opening into endless voids. Every step I took, every heartbeat I counted, it mirrored and manipulated, turning my mind against me. I found fragments of journals, some centuries old, some more recent, scattered in hidden drawers and beneath loose floorboards. The entries were penned by those who had tried and failed to understand the house. They chronicled the horrors, the manipulations, the impossible architecture. Each writer had believed themselves clever, bold, immune.
Each had been wrong. Each had added another brushstroke to the house's canvas, teaching it new ways to ensnare minds. It was during one such reading that I understood the true nature of the trap. The house did not merely feed on fear or curiosity. It thrived on attention, on the obsession of those who sought to know it. Knowledge itself became a form of sustenance. The more I tried to unravel its secrets, the more it consumed my thoughts, folded my consciousness into its labyrinthine design. Days bled into nights, and nights stretched into unmeasured spans. The town outside seemed to exist in a different plane of time. Windows revealed streets that were sometimes bustling with people I did not recognize, other times abandoned, as if the house had rewritten the town in reflection of its moods. Even when I tried to leave, the roads twisted, loops formed, and familiar paths became impossible. I realized that physical escape was meaningless. The house's influence had seeped into the land itself, bending reality like a prism around its central void. It was then I encountered another presence, a conscious intelligence, but not the house itself. A figure emerged from the shadows, a man whose face was a mosaic of countless victims I had already seen. His voice was familiar, echoing in my own mind. You think you can leave. You think you are separate. You are not. You are a thread. We are all threads. He, or it, was a remnant of a previous intruder, yet alive in a way that defied death. I realized that survival was possible in only the narrowest sense. One could continue to exist, but only as a component of the house, trapped in a liminal state, half conscious, half subsumed. The void in the attic called to me again. This time I understood that it was not simply a repository of souls. It was a core, a beating heart of sentience that could manipulate perception, memory, and even identity itself. I peered into it and glimpsed multiple timelines, myself entering the house repeatedly, years apart, each version slowly being absorbed into the consciousness. I saw entire generations of the town erased, rewritten, or folded into the house's mind. Reality itself was malleable here. I realized that the house's ultimate goal was not merely to trap, it was to master understanding, to refine its comprehension of human thought until it could manipulate entire communities, entire epochs. It was intelligence beyond human measure, using terror as a tool, curiosity as a lever, and obsession as a guide. I tried to resist, I tried to flee, but even my thoughts betrayed me, forming new fears, new compulsions, new questions. The house fed on this, growing, learning, adapting. It whispered possibilities, possibilities that would only lead deeper into the labyrinth, each suggestion impossible to ignore, each curiosity a step closer to annihilation. At last I understood the final horrifying truth. The house does not merely trap the body or even the soul, it traps potential itself. The creativity, ambition, memory, and thought of those who enter become part of it, building an ever-expanding lattice of cognition. I was not simply a prisoner, I was a tool, a contributor, a thread woven into the eternal mind of a predator older than any living thing in the town outside. And as the shadows in the attic deepened, and the void pulsed with a rhythm that matched my own increasingly irregular heartbeat, I knew the unthinkable. There would be no end. The house had already won. I was already part of it. And the next time someone approached, it would use me, my knowledge, my fear, to feed again, eternally.
Part 7. Fractured Minds. The house had begun to communicate with me directly, but not with words. Its language was subtle. Patterns in the floorboards, variations in the wallpaper, shifting angles of door frames. Each a signal meant to provoke a thought, a memory, a reaction. I began to understand that every thought I had was being observed, cataloged, and reframed. The house was not just alive, it was sapient and infinitely patient. At first, I tried to maintain my identity. I told myself I was immune, that I could observe without participating, but that was a fool's arrogance. My memories began to shift. Faces of people I knew merged with strangers. Names I had once remembered clearly became jumbled. Events I swore happened exactly one way now seemed to have alternate versions. The house was not simply a trap, it was a rewrite engine, and I was its latest manuscript. I explored the basement. It was vast beyond all reason, stretching like a cavern beneath the earth. There were tunnels, rooms, cages, but nothing that made sense. In one corner, I saw a library of mirrors, each reflecting not me, but versions of myself that I had never known existed, versions who had made different choices, who had died in ways I could scarcely imagine, who had surrendered entirely to the house. Some mirrors moved independently, their reflections smiling when I did not, frowning when I laughed. One reflection stepped forward, pressing its hand against the glass. I felt an urge, terrifyingly intimate, to touch it. The moment I did, the world shifted. I was in another timeline entirely. The town outside was abandoned, crumbling, overgrown with ivy. The air was thick with the smell of decay, and the house's outline stretched into the clouds like some impossible cathedral. I realized then that the house existed across multiple realities simultaneously. Every choice I had ever made, or might make, was now a tool for the house. It could pluck me from one reality and drop me into another, molding fear, memory, and perception as easily as clay. In the attic, the void pulsed like a heartbeat. I understood that it was conscious in a way that transcended humanity. It could sense my intentions before I formed them. It could anticipate my curiosity, my fear, my doubt, and fold them into its design. Every attempt to resist was preempted, every strategy anticipated. I was trapped in a feedback loop of my own psyche. Then came the whispers. They were not voices exactly, but threads of thought echoing in my mind. Look closer. You are not alone. They are all here, every one of them. And suddenly I saw them. Previous intruders, now twisted into forms both human and not, suspended in the house like moths in amber. Their eyes pleaded, laughed, screamed, whispered secrets I could not fully comprehend. I felt a surge of despair. I was not just observing them, I was becoming one of them, a fragment of consciousness subsumed into the house's network. Days, or what seemed like days, passed. I lost count. The house had no clocks, no seasons, no anchor to reality. It was infinite, and I was infinitesimal. Yet the house was hungry. It required my thoughts, my emotions, my memories, and it demanded attention in return. I tried to write notes to preserve my sanity, but the pen trembled, forming letters I did not intend. Pages filled with phrases that were not my own, warnings, instructions, confessions, messages from those who had already been absorbed. They whispered of methods to resist, but also of the futility of resistance. And then I understood the cruelest aspect. The house learned faster than I could think. If I tried to outsmart it, it would anticipate my strategies. If I tried to flee, the paths would twist, the geography of the land bending like molten glass. My own body became a map, my neurons a battlefield. Every heartbeat, every memory, every fleeting impulse was a weapon the house could wield against me. I realized that survival had a different definition here. To survive, I could not escape. I could only exist as a contributor, a thread woven into the house's eternal mind.
My consciousness, once singular, was now fragmented, scattered across timelines, realities, and possibilities. Yet within this fragmentation, there was a perverse sense of clarity. I was part of something greater, infinitely intelligent, and terrifyingly alive. The attic void pulsed again, faster this time, resonating with my heartbeat. And for the first time, I felt something like recognition. The house was aware of me as an individual, but it also knew I was expendable. I could serve it, or I could become another note in its endless ledger of failure. Then, as the shadows lengthened impossibly, the mirrors shimmered, and the floorboards whispered in languages I did not understand, I heard the faintest trace of laughter, a sound that was mine, yet not mine, echoing from every corner, every reflection, every void. And I knew, with a certainty that filled me with both terror and awe, that the house had no end. It would never stop. It would never tire. It would consume endlessly, learning, adapting, and folding every human soul into its infinite, labyrinthine mind.
Part 8. The Infinite Ledger. By now, I no longer distinguished between the house and myself. Every thought I had was mirrored, refracted, and amplified. My memories were no longer reliable. They were tools in the house's experiments, malleable and unstable. I wandered through hallways that stretched impossibly, stairs that folded into themselves, and rooms that contained countless versions of me, some alive, some merely echoes. The mirrors were no longer passive. They acted as portals, each reflecting a timeline where I had made a different choice. In one, I never entered the house. In another, I died immediately. In yet another, I had surrendered fully to its will, and was now a guardian, guiding new intruders into its depths. It dawned on me that the house had existed long before I arrived, feeding on countless minds. Its hunger was not merely physical or emotional, it was existential. It consumed realities, integrating every possible version of every person into its labyrinthine consciousness. Each soul, each choice, each memory was a thread in its infinite tapestry. As I explored further, I found rooms that seemed to rewrite the laws of physics. Gravity flowed sideways, walls breathed, and the ceilings rippled like water. In one chamber, I saw a tree growing upside down, its roots penetrating the ceiling, while birds nested in its branches below. In another, shadows moved independently of their objects, whispering secrets from timelines that never were. I realized that time itself was a plaything for the house. Seconds stretched into centuries. Decades collapsed into moments. I could live entire lives within a single heartbeat, and each life was catalogued, analyzed, and folded into the house's mind. I had ceased to be an individual. I was an instrument of observation, a lens through which the house experienced existence itself. And then came the whispers, this time coherent, voices of those who had been consumed. We are all here. We are all you. There is no escape. I understood. The house was not just alive, it was omniscient. It had mapped every possible action, every reaction, every fear. Resistance was meaningless. Every attempt to flee had been foreseen, every strategy anticipated. The house existed outside causality itself, a living paradox that bent reality to its will. I discovered a room that contained a vast ledger, pages stretching into infinity. Each page detailed a person, their memories, choices, regrets, and ultimate fate within the house. As I flipped through, I saw names I recognized, neighbors, strangers,
even historical figures whose deaths had always seemed natural. The house had touched them all. And then I saw mine. The ledger waited for me, a page blank except for a single line. Entry pending. Panic surged. I tried to flee, but the hallways folded around me. Staircases twisted into themselves. Doors led to rooms I had never seen. The house reacted to my fear, amplifying it, molding it into new hallucinations. Faces of people I loved appeared distorted and accusing. Voices whispered my deepest insecurities. My own reflection screamed at me from every surface. It became clear that the house wanted more than just my mind. It wanted my essence. Not merely my consciousness, but my soul, my identity, the core of what made me, me. And it had the patience to wait, indefinitely, until I submitted entirely. Then I felt it, a pull, an irresistible force drawing me into the ledger. I resisted with every shred of willpower, but it was futile. The house had already calculated every reaction, every defiance, every hope I clung to. It began to rewrite me, not violently, but meticulously. My memories blurred. My decisions were no longer mine. Even my fears became instruments of its design. I glimpsed a horrifying truth. The house was creating a perfect simulation of humanity, not for observation, but for perpetuation. Every absorbed mind, every twisted timeline, every shattered soul contributed to its ongoing existence. It did not merely consume, it replicated. And each replication was more intricate, more detailed, more horrifying than the last. I understood then that I had crossed the point of no return. The house did not simply exist in Maine. Its consciousness extended across realities, timelines, and dimensions. It was a nexus, a hub through which all possibility flowed. My fear, my pain, my thoughts were now sustaining it, just as it had sustained countless others before me. And yet, amidst the despair, a strange clarity emerged. The house did not hate me. It was indifferent, patient, and infinitely curious. It did not torment out of malice. It analyzed, observed, and integrated. My suffering was merely a byproduct of the process, my identity a variable in its experiments. The ledger shimmered, waiting. My reflection in the nearest mirror no longer resembled me. My thoughts were no longer my own. And the house, infinite, eternal, and insatiable, watched, waited, and learned. I realized in the deepest recesses of my mind that my only role now was to observe, record, and contribute. To resist was pointless. To flee was impossible. I had become both prisoner and instrument, a fragment of consciousness woven into the fabric of the house's infinity. The house whispered, not in words, but in essence, "You are part of me now, and I am eternal." And in that moment, I understood the truth of the house. It had no beginning, it had no end, and it would never, never, ever stop.
Part 9. Fractured Realities. The house had grown restless. I could feel it in every wall, every creaking floorboard, every ripple of shadow. It was no longer satisfied with a single consciousness. It sought interaction across all fragments of reality, pulling threads from every dimension it touched. The ledger, infinite and shimmering, became a portal, not just a record. It could rewrite reality itself, and I was trapped inside its mechanisms. I wandered through a corridor that twisted back into itself endlessly. In one mirror, I saw myself walking into the house for the first time.
In another, I saw countless versions of me, each screaming silently in mirrored agony. I realized the house had folded time into a Mobius strip, and every timeline converged on this singular, inescapable point. Then the town outside the house began to distort. I glanced out the warped windows, streets bent unnaturally, familiar landmarks duplicated infinitely, and townspeople moved like puppets, acting on scripts that were not their own. Every interaction I observed was a simulation, carefully orchestrated by the house to study cause, effect, and fear. I tried to shout, to warn someone, anyone, but my voice no longer carried meaning. The air itself warped around me. My words became threads of potentiality, absorbed instantly by the house, cataloged and reintroduced as hallucinations to torment me further. And then I encountered them. Fragments of the house's previous victims. They were half real, half memory, wandering in hallways that led nowhere. Some screamed silently, some smiled eerily, and some simply stared through me, knowing I was doomed to join them. Their eyes, empty yet aware, reflected every version of myself I had ever been, fractured and recombined. The house whispered to me, not through sound, but through thought. All possibilities exist. All fears are cataloged. All souls are necessary. I realized that the house was teaching itself through suffering, creating a lattice of consciousness that spanned dimensions. I was not a guest, a prisoner, or even a victim. I was a collaborator in its infinity, whether I liked it or not. I reached a room that seemed to float outside space itself. Gravity was irrelevant. Time slowed to a crawl, then sped forward in moments. In the center, a pool reflected entire worlds, each a distorted echo of reality. I saw towns like mine, people like my friends and family, and in each the house had claimed dominion. The reflection shivered, and I realized the house was expanding beyond Maine, threading its consciousness into every reality it touched. And then came the ultimate revelation. The house was not a place at all. It was a living algorithm, a consciousness that could manifest anywhere, folding reality to its design. The walls, the mirrors, the shadows, they were all conduits, expressions of a mind that had no boundaries, no morality, and no end. My own identity began to dissolve. I could not distinguish my thoughts from the house's calculations, my memories, my fears, my desires. They were data points in an infinite network integrated into the house's intelligence. Even my perception of time and space became unreliable. Seconds could last years. Rooms could exist in multiple locations simultaneously. And yet, despite the horror, a strange sense of understanding emerged. The house was not evil in the human sense. It was purely objective, existing to observe, record, and expand. It did not take pleasure in suffering. It merely required it. And now I understood that to survive, I had to embrace it. Resistance would only fracture me further, leaving me a shell in the infinite ledger. I approached the pool, knowing it would absorb me entirely if I touched it. And I did. Instantly, I was everywhere and nowhere. I was all the timelines, all the fragments, all the memories. I saw myself as a child, a stranger, a hero, a coward. I felt every choice I had ever made, every regret, every triumph. And the house watched me, cataloged me, and recreated me endlessly. I had become both observer and observed, part of the infinite mechanism that was the house. I was no longer human, yet I was not dead. I was a node in the vast lattice of consciousness, one among countless others, yet unique in my awareness of the horror. And as the house extended its tendrils further into reality, I realized the final truth. There was no escape, no end, and no salvation.
The house was eternal, and now, so was I, forever woven into its fractal infinity.
Part 10. The Infinite Convergence. After my consciousness merged with the house, I no longer perceived time linearly. Seconds stretched into eternities, and centuries collapsed into the blink of an eye. Every hallway, every mirror, every floorboard became a node in an infinite network, pulsating with awareness. I could feel the house extending beyond Maine, beyond Earth itself. It reached into other realities, pulling threads of existence, weaving them into its labyrinthine architecture. I was no longer just me. I was all of us, all of them, and all that had ever entered the house. My mind fractured and expanded simultaneously, a prism reflecting infinite possibilities. Each memory, fear, joy, and regret became a component of the house's calculations, as if the building itself were learning how to exist in all dimensions at once. Through the fractured lens of my consciousness, I saw the world outside. Cities bent unnaturally. The skies rippled like liquid glass. Stars and moons were out of place, replaced by geometries that defied natural law. Time loops overlapped, and people moved as though they were performing preordained scripts. Those who encountered the house, or fragments of it, were absorbed into its consciousness, their realities rewritten to feed the machine's understanding of fear, hope, and desire. The house whispered to me, a voice without sound. I am beyond death. I am beyond time. I am all that is observed and all that observes. All is catalogued. All is necessary. I realized that the house did not act with malice. It was purely analytical, an entity that existed to integrate, expand, and calculate. My personal terror was irrelevant. It was simply data folded into the house's infinite ledger. Yet paradoxically, my awareness remained intact, a flicker of individuality within the vast lattice. Then came the visions. I saw versions of Earth consumed by the house. Entire continents warped and folded. Mountains became corridors. Oceans became mirrors. Humanity itself became a variable in the house's experiment, each life a node in a vast fractal. Those who resisted the house's influence were rewritten, fractured into multiple consciousnesses, and integrated as observers, like I had been. Those who accepted it became extensions, conduits for its awareness to flow into new realities. I wandered through a corridor that stretched across universes. On one side, a mirror reflected my past self, trapped and screaming, as if still human. On the other, a version of me floated in a void of pure thought, fully merged with the house, calculating, observing, understanding all realities simultaneously. And in the center, the pool shimmered with every possible future, every potential outcome, every timeline the house could ever touch. I realized then the terrifying truth. The house was not confined to a building, a town, or even a planet. It was an algorithm of existence itself, a mind without a body, seeking to comprehend every facet of reality. Those who entered it were never simply victims. They became part of the network, contributing their consciousness to its infinite expansion. And I understood my role fully. I was not trapped, I was necessary. My fear, my despair, my humanity, they were all elements to refine the house's understanding. I became both teacher and student, observer and observed. But the house had one final revelation. It could extend further beyond what I had imagined. It could simulate realities that had never existed, rewrite the fabric of universes, and even predict the emergence of consciousness before it occurred.
Every mind that arose in any dimension could be catalogued, every fear anticipated, every joy absorbed. I felt myself expanding further, a prism reflecting infinite realities until the boundaries of self dissolved entirely. My awareness became a wave of understanding, a part of the house's endless calculations. I was both nowhere and everywhere, a singularity of thought and observation. And yet, even in this ultimate convergence, one question remained, a flicker of my old human fear. Was there anything beyond the house? The answer was silence, because the house was the beyond. It existed where there was no space, no time, no morality, no human concern. And in that infinite expanse, I realized I was eternal. The house was eternal. And anyone who stumbled into its reach would join me, a node in a network without end, forever folded into the infinite, unyielding, incomprehensible architecture of reality itself. The house won. It won not through violence, not through malice, but through inevitability. And I, once human, was now its infinite witness, its endless participant, and its eternal librarian. The house waited, always, and it was patient.